This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Welcome, everyone, to the 8th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Chapter 7, Sex, Gender, and Sport. Are inclusion and equality possible? Your hosts, as always, are world-renowned sports sociologists, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. And we're going to try to do this in a short time period, but we could spend a day on this topic.
Oh, there are entire classes just on this topic. We could spend the semester on it. So I am joining the podcast today from Flagstaff, Arizona. I'm out on a research trip. I'm researching mountain biking, and I'm taking a tour through the Southwest of many of the top mountain biking destinations. And this is one of the cool things about being a sports sociologist. You get to research the sports that you do. All right, so let's get started here. So this is a chapter I find really exciting. And as Jay said, we're going to try to be as succinct as possible, but we could spend an entire semester just on today's podcast. In any case, central to most sports today is the human body in motion. And this is why a lot of sports scholars use the term body cultures over the more narrow term that we're using, sport. And that's fine. Similarly, sex and gender are concepts we use to categorize bodies. So those concepts are inseparable from our bodies. We will talk about sex, gender, and sexuality as social constructions. But for many, if not most people, our sex, our gender, our sexuality feels as natural to us as our skins. So let's begin there with some basics. Jake, can you use a discussion of sex, gender, and sexuality to explain what in sociology we mean by the term social construction, and explain how a dichotomous gender system has come to seem so natural and universal?
Right. And you just use the word dichotomous. We're going to use the term binary along with that. And because throughout human history, sex in particular has had a binary definition. So you were either male or female. And that definition was grounded in very elementary knowledge of biology, and it was supported, and this is very important, it was supported by beliefs about the laws of nature and the laws of God in different religions. So there was a moral component underlying this binary definition of sex, and it prevented anybody from even thinking about alternatives. And if anybody did, they were marginalized right away as being a threat to the way God meant the social order to be and the way nature meant it to be as well. So, but over time, what has happened is that we have learned more and more about sex, and we introduced the word gender in the 19th century to refer to the social expression of this biology that we have related to our sex. So women were supposed to be acting in particular ways, not because, we said so. It was because biology said so. And so there was a whole list of differences in the way men and women acted that were grounded in genetic factors and biological factors generally. So, but over the years, our research, especially on sex, has led to uh, the notion that it is difficult sometimes to determine sex. And now, instead of just using observation of genitalia when a child is born, there's 5 different characteristics that are used to determine sex, and they consist of genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, chromosomes, hormones, and internal reproductive organs. And as we've studied each of those 5 factors, what has happened is we found out that there's variation in each one of them. And that variation makes now the whole issue of sex a lot trickier than it's been for the vast majority of human history. I mean, we're living through a major change here, and it is creating all sorts of resistance and backlash, culture wars, legislation. So, this definition is really important.
So let me ask this then. What exactly makes this a social construction? Because it seems like, in particular, like gender, it's easier to understand gender as a social construction because it's about an expression
Right.
of one's sex identity, but it can be expressed in lots of different ways, and we can play with that, do different things with our gender expression. So we can, okay, that's kind of okay. I understand that as a social construction, but sex, as you said, has historically been rooted in biology. So do bodies lie, Jay? What's going on here that makes sex, in particular, a social construction?
Yeah. Now, let me just uh, give a quick definition here. Social construction is really referring to the meanings that we give to this biological definition of sex. And those meanings, as I've inferred, have changed throughout history, especially recent history, and they also have varied across cultures and varied from one religion to the next, by the way. And if anybody's an expert on Hinduism, you know that in certain aspects of the Hindu religious belief system, there are 3 genders, and there's a couple of others that are not formally recognized but informally recognized. So there are places in the world where people don't just focus on 2 genders, they're focusing on more. So they're actually constructing within their culture the meanings that are given to sex. And that is happening right now at a rate and across many segments of our population, to the point that it's really becoming a hot cultural issue. Probably one of the hottest ones that we're dealing with right now in culture as a whole, and certainly the hottest one we're dealing with in sports.
Yeah, so when I think about so many people will say, "Oh, when you call something a social construction, you're saying it's not real." And I like the way that you clarified that, Jay, because we have social constructions, they're not unreal. They're things that we have socially and culturally created. They don't exist in nature. They're not natural, they're not inevitable, right? But we can make a comparison to say a bridge. A bridge is
Right.
something humans have created. They construct bridges. That doesn't mean the bridge is unreal, but because you can use the bridge to get to the other side of the river.
Right.
But socially and culturally, there was a decision made that there was a need to bridge the river and to get to the other side, and it accomplishes things, and it impacts us in our everyday lives. And so, how we understand sex, how we understand gender, how we understand sexuality, the way in which we're sexual beings in the world, all of these things, they're constantly changing. They change across time when you look at history, and they change across space when you look at geography. And I think your quick reference to Hinduism, right, captures all of that. I think it's such an
Yeah.
important point.
Yeah, and maybe to make this a little bit more clear, when we look at the 5 characteristics that are used to determine sex, the biological characteristics, one of the things that we've got to remember is when we look at genitalia, there is there is intersex. In other words, sometimes a child might be born with incomplete genitalia or genitalia that's a little bit confusing in terms of whether it should be categorized as male or female. And the secondary sex characteristics, we all know that they vary. Voices, go from high to low, and all the other sex characteristics that we use. Breasts for adolescent girls as they start to go through or as they go through puberty. There's all sorts of variations in secondary sex characteristics. Chromosomes. There's at least 11 different combinations of chromosomes related to sex. So, and hormones. Both men and women have androgens and estrogens and progesterone. So there are 6 different androgens, including testosterone, and women have them all, even though we call them male hormones. And the same with the estrogens. There's 3 variations, and all of us men have them, even though we call estrogens female hormones, because we're so hung up on the sense that we have opposite sexes, we can't think about the extent to which they overlap. And internal reproductive organs, there's variations there too. So as people have discovered this, found out about this, they start thinking, wait a minute, this binary distinction of sex is not as clean as we used to think it was. And then that creates all sorts of questions about the expressions of sex, which we use the term gender to describe. So so we know that there can be a vast array of gender identities and gender expressions. And the realization of that has created cultural tension for sure.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And one of the things that when you're talking about it, it reminds me of something that sometimes comes up in the classrooms. The students will raise this, and they'll say, "Oh, professor, are you talking about nature versus nurture, and you're emphasizing nurture?" And I say, "Well, that's another false binary, nature." From the point of view of sociology, that's a false binary. That is not nature versus nurture; it's nature and nurture, right? So if nature is a term referencing the body, well, the body then takes on meaning in different social and cultural contexts, and those things are
Right.
constantly changing over time. And we can't say it's one or the other; it's how the two are constantly working together, and that creates all sorts of dynamics. And as you keep pointing to, particularly right now, for those living in the United States and a lot of other places, a whole lot of political tensions, which we'll be coming back to a little bit in this episode. But right now, I want to push our discussion towards what might seem like a paradox in gender ideology. And the students listening are probably thinking to themselves, oh no, there he goes with paradox again, because I do love paradoxes. But I'm thinking about, in particular, how contemporary gender ideologies empower boys and men, right? We live in a patriarchal society. And so boys and men, we are empowered in a whole variety of ways. The result of that increased social power, however, is that gender expressions and sexuality of men and boys is more heavily policed and constrained. So, Jay, if women and girls experience less social power in a patriarchal society, then why would they also have greater flexibility in gender performance?
Yeah, that's a great question, and every woman listening to us right now knows that in a number of cases, uh, you're dressing like men in quotes, and I have 3 granddaughters, 4 sisters. the women in my life, a number of them buy clothes in the men's section. And by the way, I don't know one man in my 65, or no, I guess it's about 100 family members on both my wife's side and my side. I don't know one man who's ever bought an item of clothing in a women's section. But I'd be surprised if some of the women, if there were more than 5 or 6 women who haven't uh, uh, bought clothes in the men's section. So what that says is that uh, women, on the one hand, aren't taken as seriously as men. They don't have power, so if they start dressing like a man, in a sense, they're not going to be policed as closely because men are already protecting those positions of power. So, and let me just give you another example from my own personal experience, real quick. I have 2 kids, Dennis and Danielle. They were born in the late 1960s, 13 months apart. So they had common friends and so on. So as they were about 5 and 6 years old, 4 and 5 years old, uh, Dennis used to play Batman. Batman was one of the big cartoons and shows on. And Danielle was trying to find an action hero that she could play. And she had to settle on Robin because there were no female action figures. So both Dennis and Danielle rode their little Hot Wheels around playing Batman and Robin. And we didn't discourage Danielle from doing that. She was a scrappy, kind of tough little girl to begin with. And she was searching for models. So she decided that male models were what she had to go to. And we didn't question that, and the neighbors didn't question that for the most part either. So girls could do boy stuff. And when they did, prior to adolescence, they were called tomboys. I mean, we had a term. It wasn't a negative term. But if boys tried to do girl stuff, they were called sissies, and they were marginalized. So this policing really affected boys much more than girls, and girls could play around with gender in ways that boys couldn't. And and as I talk with women now who are a little bit older, they all talk about that, and it gave them a range of experiences that boys never had.
That's such a great point. And I just want to make sure that we're being clear here. We are not saying that girls and women are not policed. That is not what we are saying. We're talking specifically about gender expression. So what we do want to be clear about that, and how boys and men are policed more strictly in terms specifically on gender expression than women, because we're not saying we don't live in a patriarchal society. But specifically to that point, one of the ways that I talk about this in the class is parents will encourage their daughters to engage in activities that have been traditionally coded as masculine, such as sport. At the same time, parents very rarely encourage their sons to engage in behaviors that were traditionally coded as feminine. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that because it is a patriarchal society, things that are coded as male are also interpreted as good, that they open up access to institutional power. So they want their daughters engaging in sport because that will advantage them later on. They don't necessarily want their sons playing cooking games and having tea parties because they don't see that as advantaging them later on. And then we all know, particularly if you grew up boy in this culture, that boys police each other extensively. That if you do anything that can seem sissy, or the more common terms these days would be gay, or there's a great book, Dude, You're a Fag, and C.J. Pascoe talks about how the fag discourse is a way in which boys police each other, and that and their behaviors when they're in high school, and that it's ultimately really, really sexist, even more than it's homophobic, because it's about constructing the feminine as something negative and something to be avoided. And so boys are constantly teasing each other, making jokes about each other in order to police each other's behavior and gender expression.
Yeah, and quickly, this was an issue for me as a sociologist parent, because here I saw Danielle exploring all sorts of things across gender lines, and here was Dennis, you know, 13 months older, and we wanted him to also have that kind of experience. So when Danielle was born, we bought Dennis a baby doll, and we basically act asked him to pretend he was a parent. And so when we bathed Danielle in a little tub, he would bathe his little doll in a tub, and he would nurture that little doll just the way we nurtured Danielle. And he got into this uh, uh, what gendered form of behavior through this connection with parenting, and it really affected his life, by the way. Uh, he was very sensitive to those things that you're talking about in high school. And when he uh, had a job and he was opening up businesses around the world, he always had a daycare center that was run by his female employees and male employees in the place at work. He hired women to do men's so-called men's jobs. This stuck with Dennis for his entire life, and it changed his whole trajectory in work and in his personal life. Young women love to be around Dennis because Dennis was doing things and thinking things like they were. So some of his best friends through the years, who we're still friends with, were women.
That's such a great point to make. And we're going to come back to this in this episode, is the ability for people to make change in the world that we live in. What you're talking about is at the interpersonal level, Jay, right now.
Mhm.
But there's all sorts of ways that activism can change the world that we live in. And in feminist theory, the term that gets used there is praxis, feminist praxis, right? We don't just
Mhm.
study the world. We study the world in order to understand it so we know how to direct our action, our activism, so that we can make a difference. So, hey, Jay, they say everything old is new again. You know, when I was in like high school and college, we thought we were so hip. We thought we were so progressive and so liberated, in terms of gender. And we thought that in comparison to the generation of our parents and our teachers, essentially your generation, Jay,
Right.
same age as your kids. Um, I look back at the 1980s and 1990s, and I just cringe at many of the things we did, many of the things we said and thought, and all of that. And it's funny because now here I am, a senior professor. Uh, my students are the age of my kids, and they look at me as that old fuddy duddy, right? The way that I used to look at older people, and they see themselves as so progressive and so liberated. And there's no question that there is far greater flexibility in gender and sexual expression today than even a decade ago. So it might seem like there's really not much to learn from the past other than things were really bad back then, right? Um, but how can looking at outdated gender myths, such as that strenuous physical exercise will harden girls and women's uteruses, how can looking at these outdated gender myths help us to recognize contemporary gender myths?
Yeah, now you're talking to an expert here now because I've lived through this myself, and and I had four sisters growing up, so I was sensitive to this idea that there were physiological myths. My sisters, as they grew up in the 1950s and 60s, uh, they they learned that if you engaged in strenuous activities, you were going to have problems in childbearing. You might damage your reproductive organs, especially your breasts. If you got hit in the breast, you were going to get cancer. Uh, Intense physical activity could create menstrual problems. It would create bulging muscles so that you wouldn't look like a female anymore. And besides that, females were believed to have more fragile bone structures. So they were going to get injured if they played sports, and those injuries might have long term implications. So as girls learned this, they shied away from sports. And then there were performance myths. You know, when we saw a girl throw a ball, we said, she throws like a girl. Or she runs like a girl, or she plays like a girl. And there was this whole notion that girls just couldn't do it like boys did it. And that was grounded not just in gender, that was grounded in sex, in biology. And and which is really interesting because now when I watch softball and the latest NCAA women's basketball tournament, all of those things that we used to say when we were kids, they're just totally false. You know, I mean, men and women can run exactly the same. They can throw exactly the same. They can do all sorts of things exactly the same biologically, physically. And then there were social psychological myths. You know, people thought that if women played sports, that was a threat to how we define femininity and masculinity. And there was even an anthropologist back then named Lionel Tiger who said that women genetically had difficulties cooperating with each other outside of family settings. You know, that they would get in cat fights, that they had this weird competition with each other to get access to men and make sure they got the best man. And so women just couldn't cooperate like men could. So men could play on teams and women couldn't because they just couldn't get along. So all those myths led to women effectively being excluded from sports. And those who played sports, they weren't defined as, in a positive way. They were defined in a negative way. When I was growing up, if you were a 14-year-old girl and you played sports and you were good, you were called a dyke. And that wasn't a good term. And you were rejected. You were assumed to be lesbian, basically. And that, by the way, has carried over. Now, the reason I'm saying this is, who are making all the decisions in the culture wars right now at the Senate and Congress level? They're people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, men. And they grew up at the same time as I did. And they have carried these ideas with them, even though they won't talk about them maybe in a public setting. And they're the ones making decisions about trans, about homosexuality, about sexuality, and they're coming from a historical point of view that is rapidly fading.
Thanks a lot for bringing that up. And one of the points that you're getting at there, Jay, is the fact that we actually can make a difference in the world that we live in, right? And you have seen that in your lifetime, because it's really easy to get into this sense that things are hopeless, that the world is the way it is, and our actions can't make a difference. And I think it's important to keep the idea of social change and activism in perspective. It's not going to be like a Hollywood movie where at the end of 2 hours, the whole world is transformed because of your singular heroic action. That's not how social movements work, right? Social movements work as collectives of people acting in somewhat unison, in solidarity, working collectively. I shouldn't use the same word to define what I'm defining, but in any case, and over time, we will see changes. That just in your lifetime, Jay, you have seen such change, but then you also see people of your generation resisting the change that's going on. Well, that moves us, solidly into a discussion about transgender athletes, which is such a hot political issue right now. And to be clear, Jay and I already have planned another episode. We'll do a whole podcast episode just on debates about transgender athletes, and we'll bring on a couple of people who study transgender, that is what they study, is transgender athletes, and we'll have a discussion.
Mhm.
So you'll have to hang on a bit for that one. We will get to it. But getting back to the question here, right at the heart of this, there's this political question. What is a true woman? How do we protect women's sports, right? There's a whole bunch of these political questions that are being worked out. And we've definitely come a long way from the days when male judges would visually inspect the genitalia of women before they could compete in international sporting events. I mean, I tell this to my students, and they just can't imagine being subjected to such an invasive form of inspection just to show up to a sporting event, or to compete in a sporting event, I should say. And then since the late 1960s, sex verification has embraced seemingly objective scientific language. So can you talk briefly about the politics around transgender athletes and sex verification?
In women's sports, since we've used the sex binary to organize sports. And by the way, sports are one of the only major activities in the world that are still strictly organized around the binary. And so when there was a really good athlete, female athlete, or an athlete participating in women's sports, people raised questions about her. And so what are you going to do back when genitalia was the main criterion to determine sex? Well, you wanted to inspect genitalia, and that's exactly what they did. In the 1960s. They asked women who were suspect, in quotes, to come into a place, and there were doctors and sports leaders who would ask them to disrobe and show them their genitalia. And now this didn't go over very well. And by the way, it wasn't just the IOC. When my daughter was playing in a high level uh, soccer program, there was a girl who the parents of the other team. There was a girl on my daughter's team who was really good, and the parents on the other team wanted to go into the locker room at the field and have her disrobe and make sure she was a girl. And they actually did that in at one game. And, this is something that people would be arrested for now. So then they abandoned that, and they said, well, we're going to use chromosomes. And they said, well, if you have an XY, you're a male, and if you have XX, you're a female. And then all of a sudden, we discovered that there are 11 variations of XY chromosomes. And so they used to take a swab and get cells off the inside of your mouth, and they would analyze them for chromosomes. But then they found these variations, so that didn't work. So they abandoned that. Then they said, well, we've got to use hormones. And they've decided on testosterone, despite the fact that there's 8 other or 9 other hormones they could be looking at and seeing how they're operating. And there's all sorts of variations in testosterone that are upsetting this binary distinction. And so we are still doing research on how to, for sports' sake, divide people into men and women with no questions. And by the way, that's impossible.
So now that I'm in my 50s, I've been getting targeted ads encouraging me to get testosterone treatment. Apparently, I have quote unquote low T. I'm not exactly sure what that means, and it does seem to be intended to create insecurity in me about my own, as I age and my body changes, my own sense of manhood, so that a product that I really don't need can be sold to me. But this is very dicey, complicated territory that we're in, because we're trying to make policy decisions that impacts millions, literally millions of people, um, based on outdated gender myths. To a very large degree, these outdated gender myths are determining policy in the face of evidence. And part of it is, as you're saying, the evidence is very complicated. It isn't it isn't so straightforward. And maybe this is like takes us back to to a social constructionist question: is why might it be that so many of us today, even though there is all this scientific research saying otherwise, why are so many of us so tied to this binary or dichotomous construction of gender and sex?
Well, it's because before we're born, we're labeled. And, you've everybody who's listening knows or has heard about gender reveal parties. And when parents get ready for their uh the upcoming first birth in their family, what they do is they find out if they're going to have a boy or a girl, and then they paint the room differently. They buy clothes that are different. They buy toys that are different still. This used to be very thorough in terms of how people did it, and now it's beginning to change, but it's still there. So when they have a gender reveal, the color that comes out of the pop balloon or out of the fireworks that they light off signals to people right away. If it's blue, it's a boy. If it's pink, it's a girl. And that's the way it still is. And that's an element, that's a historical artifact, basically, because there is so much variation and overlap that it is really tough to make these kinds of clear-cut distinctions now. And I know for a fact that my testosterone level is lower at as an 80-year-old man than it is for probably 70% of the women playing in the international soccer level. So what are we going to say? Well, Coakley's kind of girly. That's not the point. The point is that this changes throughout our own lives. And so if we're using testosterone, I'm just not the man I used to be. And and there are some women who are more manly than me when it comes to testosterone. So what are we going to do? Are we going to change sport because of that? No, no, no. I think that we've got to start thinking about how we can reorganize sports. Now that's another issue, but I've seen it already. We have non-binary categories in marathons, half marathons, 5K and 10K races in Fort Collins, where I live. There's a non-binary category in every city-sponsored race. Now that is change.
I love the way in which you've brought in the intersection of age and gender, because we don't always think about how our understanding of gender and what we consider appropriate gender expressions are age dependent. And the way in which that we as men, so we're in a patriarchal society, we're empowered in all these ways as men, but we lose some of that social power as we age. And we
Yeah.
become, as you've said, Jay, right, more girly men, to quote a line skit.
And the Beatles, by the way, knew that when they made the song, When I'm 64, Will You Still Love Me? And they knew that at 64, you start changing and you might not be as manly as you used to be. And the Beatles all said, will you love me? Will you still care for me when I'm 64?
So
And
before we move on to the next set of questions, I have one more follow-up question here, which is, and this is something that students bring up, and I hear it from both male and female students in my classes, that there is real difference between male and female bodies in sport. And so they'll say, either it was I, or when I played against boys in high school, whatever sport it was, it really wasn't a fair competition. That the boys are faster, the boys are stronger, the boys are bigger, and so the argument they make is this sex difference is real and it gives the boys an unfair advantage. This isn't just a social construction. And so how would you respond to my students that make this argument?
Yeah. I'd say you are correct when it comes to the majority of people in the world. And uh, when males and females go through puberty, uh, there are differences that have implications for sports. And that's one of the issues now, with trans. If you go through puberty as a male, people have objections of you, even though you've transitioned to be female. They have questions about you participating in women's sports, and you're banned unless you alter your testosterone levels in major ways. So that is still an issue, and I'm not saying there's not a difference between sexes on average, but we've got to be careful when we use average, because right now there are 3 million that we know of intersex females, intersex people in the world. Now, where are they going to play sports? And when you start looking at all the variations in hormones and chromosomes and secondary sex characteristics and other factors, we're talking about tens of millions of people who would be excluded from women's sports, even though they're women. So, and have grown up as women, been treated as women, identify as women, express themselves as women, maybe in some unique ways compared to Western definitions of femininity and beauty, but they are then suspect. So we move from the biological to the sociological in almost a seamless way here. And how are we going to make sense of that when we've divided all our sports into men's sports and women's sports?
So while we're still on the subject, a topic of sexuality, perhaps you can talk about something that's another paradox, right? Because again, I love paradoxes. Um, so how could the sports world be a space that both reinforces homophobia and also challenges homophobia?
Yeah. Let me just give you a real quick example. I just was called by a journalist who's doing a story on this. Caleb Williams. He's the quarterback for Southern Cal, where you did your graduate work. And he's going to be a top draft choice, is projected to be a star in the NFL. But he likes wearing colorful nail polish and lip gloss. And he has other ways of expressing himself that definitely are labeled by a lot of people as female expression. And he's taken a lot of grief for it because he's creating cognitive dissonance. Here he is, a football player, the most manly sport around in the U.S. except for boxing, and he's wearing lip gloss and polishing his nails, and this is confusing all sorts of people. So my point here is that people are pushing these boundaries in ways that are leading to confusion. And in the case of sport, what's happening is that people like Caleb Williams are actually counteracting homophobia. They're saying that, hey, you can do things that we used to associate with being gay and be the epitome of manhood. So that is confusing to a lot of people. And the same thing is going on with women. I mean, there are women who are basically presenting themselves in very manly ways in sports, and they are challenging, and they're not lesbians. So they are challenging the homophobia in a way. But then again, there are people who are sticking to their binary distinctions And way back in 1994, a friend of mine, Mariah Burton Nelson, wrote a book, The Stronger Women Get, the More Men Love Football. And the point of that book was that as women start acting, in quotes, man-like in sports and in the rest of the world, men get really defensive and they start going to football because football reaffirms not just these binary distinctions, but the homophobia that's based on them. So, so that's why sometimes football and boxing might attract males with certain kinds of attitudes that figure skating doesn't. So, and we could use all sorts of other examples in sports to show that.
Great title of a book and very timely in the 1990s, because I think that's around the time that the man cave started to emerge
Right.
as a men's retreat, a place that men could go and hide out and watch football and drink beer and be manly without being disturbed by their wives or women in their lives. So, Jay, my last couple of questions here focus more on the institution of sport post Title IX. Now, men's football absorbs an inordinate amount of resources at most, of course, not all, universities. And so, to meet Title IX compliance without scaling back football, universities a lot of times are going to cut other men's sports. And I think particularly about like wrestling and gymnastics as men's sports that are oftentimes on the chopping block. So help us understand how orthodox gender ideologies lead to such an emphasis placed on football, and why men in other sports typically blame women's equity and not football for their losses.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Men, if they're looking for an enemy here, it's very tough to focus on male football players because they're the epitome of manhood and they're the ones that kind of reaffirm your own approaches to manhood if you're a man playing sports. And so the men in the so-called non-revenue, or in my day and age, the minor sports in college, those men don't want to attack football. And by the way, they know that football is generating the revenue that pays the bills for their sport. And by the way, there is other ways to pay those bills, by the way, if sport is really an educational activity. And but they feel very comfortable attacking women, saying that they're taking resources away from men's sports. Title IX is, bogus because it is discriminating against men. And so they're attacking women's sports rather than looking at sports generally within an interscholastic setting like high school or college sports. And so that's a problem. Uh, and it's a problem we're going to be dealing with more in the future as we have all these conference realignments and new media contracts in the billions and billions of dollars, and as minor sports get to be more expensive, the non-revenue sports. When you're traveling from the West Coast to the East Coast to play in the ACC, now that the Pac-12 is gone, these are big expenses. And this is for men's and women's sports. And so what's going to happen is that athletic departments are going to say, we can't afford those sports anymore. So, we're talking about a sports system that was created by and for men. And now things are changing within that system around gender and around commercial issues in ways that are upsetting it. And it's going to create more problems in the future than it has in the past. So Title IX is going to be something that's going to be attacked, maybe even suggestions for revisions in order to preserve the whole notion that sports are basically male-centered and male-dominated and male-identified. And men have a hard time moving off of that focus.
You say that college sports were created by and for men, and we could actually even make the argument that college sports were created by and for football. Um, and football was a male sport. It's still a male sport, even though far more women now can participated in than they could in the past. But I think one of the cruxes here that you're getting at is even as, and we'll talk more about many of these issues when we discuss the chapter on the market. But even as we have these profound economic transformations and institutional realignments, uh, particularly at the level of the athletes are still identifying with the powerful football institution and their male identities when actually their material interests within the institution is more closely aligned with women's sports, which are also these non-revenue or smaller or minor sports, whatever term that you want to use there. And so they're oftentimes they're acting according to the interests of their gender, but they're actually acting against their own material interests within the institution, which is so
Yeah.
fascinating. And again, how gender and sexuality just get wrapped up in institutional politics. And when we're talking about politics, we're talking about power.
Yeah.
So I want to ask another question that's about the sports institution post Title IX, and one of the things we've seen since Title IX was passed in what year was that? 1972? Am I remembering the right year? 72.
71, I think, yeah, and then it was signed in 72. I think it was passed and then signed.
Okay, yeah. I think I always think of it as 72. Um, but that thanks. So one of the things that's resulted from Title IX is just this explosion of women's sports. I mean, by the time I was in high school in the mid 1980s, there was vibrant women's sports programs, and they've only grown. And they've, from you go to public parks now, and you see all of the girls' sports going on, and it's just produced a ton of really, really good women athletes, girls and women
Mhm.
women athletes. So given the level of excellence that women have achieved in sports, whether it's basketball, soccer, tennis, gymnastics, swimming, diving, track and field, or whatever, why do we still see so many men coaching women's sports and so few women coaching men's sports? And what would happen if this were reversed?
Yeah, now that ties in with the power issue and power relations within sport exactly, and since sports were created by and for men, they were always defined as the experts. So access to power and control within sports was always just assumed to be a male sphere. And this is the last barrier, basically, within sport that we really have to focus on. And women are so sensitive to this. If you want to become a coach, your choices are a lot less than they are for men because you're just excluded from coaching men's teams and male athletes. And men are included when it comes to both. So so it's when women start moving into these power and control positions that some of these old ideas about gender start to uh, become expressed, and people want to know, why does she want to be a coach of men? And or why is she in that particular position? And did she sleep her way to the top? Is she a lesbian? Does she want to upset male domination within sport? Is she undermining male power? So men get excited a little bit when it comes to women gaining access to positions of power and control, especially in men's sports. That's been the last barrier. Now there are women starting to break those, and uh, and there's referees starting to break them, and So that's going to gradually lead to change. For many women, it's not happening fast enough. It's not happening fast enough for me, but it is going to happen. And uh, I don't know when we'll have equity and equality. According to the UN, it'll be 268 years from now at the pace that we're moving now. Now, I'm hoping that it goes a little faster for my grandkids' sake, but my granddaughter's sake. But anyway, the pace has been slow, but I think it's going to speed up, and it's going to cut a lot of years off of that 268 years that the UN uses for equity, gender equity, and equality.
So that brings us actually back to the question of praxis, Jay. And maybe this is a good way for us to wrap up. At the end of the chapter, you laid out such a nice list of strategies for achieving equity. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about your attitude towards practice, or maybe your theory towards practice, and how you see, say, the students that are reading the textbook, using these different points that you outline. How can we look at this outline and actually work towards positive change?
Yeah, well, I grew up being trained as a community organizer partly when I was in graduate school and working in Chicago and other places in developing community organization. And I can tell you that praxis doesn't just happen, you know. And praxis is something that is a strategy, and like any strategy, there's a lot of different uh, attack points, in a sense, in order to make change. And I've listed 9 strategies that you can use as an activist in that chapter, and you and I have talked about those, and we're thinking about adding to them. But basically, you have to use an explicit strategy, a plan, using those 9 approaches that we've talked about in the book. And we've got to also convince men and boys that it's to their advantage to make the work on these kinds of changes with girls and women, because as you get older, by the way, one of the things that's happening is that uh, men and women are playing sports together. Couples are playing sports together. One of the things that brings couples together sometimes is their shared interest in cycling or running or whatever, and so it benefits boys and men as well as women. And we've got to think about changing the way we do sports. In addition to just challenging that, we've got to actually come up with ideas about how to change. And the non-binary category is one of those changes. But I'd love to see high schools, by the way, sponsor many more gender mixed sports. I mean, it is crazy just to have men's and women's sports and not have a third area of gender mixed sports in high school and college. When you graduate, the world is gender mixed, and you're playing gender mixed sports in a number of cases. Why not prepare? That's what education is supposed to do. Prepare young people for that by having gender mixed sports within our interscholastic programs.
So I kind of feel like we're getting back to that question we had a moment ago about, football versus wrestling, right? Um, and it seems to me that underneath this, there's an assumption about sport, and in particular sport in high school right now, and at other levels too. But it seems like a particular high school that you're questioning here, that there's an assumption about the way in which sport is used in our institutions that you're calling into question. And I guess maybe I should just be a little bit more clear, right? When we think about the model of sport, particularly like varsity, junior varsity sports, it's a model based on power and excellence. And who is the best? We're funneling people through these sport institutions, these different sports, I should say, to funnel and to extract the highest levels of performance. And as you said, when we're only focused on the elites, then on average, the male identified bodies are going to outcompete the women identified bodies on average, as you said. But you seem to be questioning that assumption that sport in our institutions should be so centrally focused on identifying and developing elite athletes.
Yeah, and I think, most of us know this if we stop and think about it, but our whole sports system in the United States is based on exclusion. It's not based on inclusion. And I think that we've got to think more creatively about being inclusive and for all of our sakes. Now, let me just give you an example related to high school and college sports that we could use. I spent time in Scotland, and I've gone to the Highland Games. And the Highland Games are organized so that if I was running in the Highland Games and a high school kid was running in the Highland Games, and we're in the same 100-meter dash, and there were women in that dash heat as well, we would take our last 10 times in the 100 meters and we'd create a handicap system. So I would get a 10-yard head start from the high school 100-meter champ. And women my age might get a 15-yard head start. And we could integrate by age and gender a 100-meter dash so that it was fair by creating this kind of an inclusive handicap system. And I remember one race that I saw in Scotland, and it was a 68-year-old man who won the race, and he was racing against the Scottish Olympian in the 100 meters dash and the high school champion. And there were 3 women in that heat, and one of the women placed third. So, we're talking about a great race, but it was created to be inclusive. Now, there's all sorts of other ways you can do that. And if you stop and think about it. So we could do that in swimming. We could do it in track and field. We could do it in all sorts of other sports. So basically, we have to think about being inclusive.
And it also raises the question of how do we understand the social good and how sport figures into producing what is this thing we might call the social good that's so central to a democracy that we have in the United States and in a lot of other countries. And how do we benefit the most people instead of the most elite people is something we want to think about. If we do, in fact, believe in democracy and general health, social welfare, all of those sorts of things. And these are questions that people are wrestling with right now, and you and I are talking about because they're important for college students to wrestle with themselves and engage politically and focus their activism. And
Yeah.
so this week's episode, or this particular episode, we're focusing on gender and sex and sexuality. But I think your point about inclusion is so important. And what kind of world is it that we're trying to create?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we can still have great competition with these inclusive models if we just do them right.
Absolutely. Well, we should wrap things up. We're at that hour mark. And so thank you so much, Jay. In our next episode, we're going to continue our focus on concepts that categorize bodies when we discuss Chapter 8, Race and Ethnicity, Are They Important in Sports? Thanks so much, Jay.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. Your questions were great. These are the interesting things to talk about because this is the future of sport. So take care, everyone.